Have you ever tried to explain a rotary phone to someone who grew up swiping glass screens, and then 5 minutes later found yourself asking a teenager how to fix a Wi-Fi router? If you were born somewhere between 1976 and 1985, that moment probably feels very familiar. You remember life before the internet, not theoretically, not as a cute retro aesthetic. You remember it in your body, the sound of dial-up, the way Saturday morning cartoons felt like an event, the way if someone wasn't home, they just weren't home. And yet, here you are, fluent in memes, navigating group chats, working in cloud-based systems, maybe even teaching your parents how to use FaceTime. So what are you? Not quite Gen X, not quite millennial. Welcome to the strange, fascinating psychological world of the Xennial. The term Xennial describes people born roughly between 1976 and 1985, a microgeneration wedged between Generation X and Millennials. But this isn't just a demographic technicality. Psychologically, it's something much more interesting. Because you didn't just live through change, you were shaped by the shift. Let me paint a picture. You're 10 years old. You come home from school, no smartphone, no social media, maybe a house key on a shoelace around your neck. You make a snack, turn on the TV, and watch whatever is on. There is no algorithm curating your interests. You don't text friends, you call them. And if their parents answer, you have to navigate that awkward small talk before asking, "Can so-and-so come out?" Fast forward 10 years, you're in college. Suddenly there's email, maybe MySpace, early Facebook, cell phones that flip open dramatically. The world is moving, fast, and you're young enough to adapt, but old enough to remember when things were slower. That dual exposure does something to your brain. Psychologists often talk about developmental imprinting, the idea that the world you experience in adolescence wires your expectations about how life works. For Gen X, adolescence happened mostly in an analog world. For millennials, it unfolded in a digital one. But for Xennials, your adolescence was a psychological border crossing. And living on a border changes you. Research on cultural frame switching suggests that people who grow up navigating multiple cultures become more cognitively flexible. They learn to shift perspectives, to translate, to adapt. Xennials often show similar mental flexibility, not because of geography, but because of technology. You can operate in both worlds. You remember when privacy was default, and you understand that now it's optional. You value independence deeply, like Gen X, but you're also collaborative and digitally connected like millennials. And sometimes that creates tension, because part of you craves simplicity, and another part thrives in complexity. Have you noticed this? That you can spend hours optimizing a workflow on your laptop, but secretly miss the feeling of being unreachable? That you're comfortable with tech, but slightly suspicious of it? That's not random. Your nervous system was calibrated in a lower stimulation environment. Childhood in the 80s and early 90s meant boredom, and boredom, psychologically speaking, is not empty space. It's cognitive gym time. It builds imagination, internal dialogue, creative problem solving. Then the internet arrived. Suddenly stimulation was constant. Dopamine on demand, notifications, feeds, updates. For many younger millennials and Gen Z, this was the baseline. But for you, it was an upgrade, an addition, not the original operating system. And that creates a unique relationship with attention. You know what it feels like to focus deeply because you had to. There was nothing else to do. And you also know the pull of digital distraction, so you often oscillate between deep immersion and total overwhelm. You can binge an entire series on Netflix in a weekend, and then suddenly feel nostalgic for when you had to wait a week for the next episode. That push and pull is the psychology of transition. Xennials are often described as resilient, and that's not just a flattering stereotype. You entered adulthood during massive global shifts, the rise of the internet, economic turmoil, the 2008 financial crisis. You learned quickly that stability isn't guaranteed. But here's the nuance. Unlike older Gen Xers, who were often raised with a strong figure-it-out-yourself ethos, and unlike younger millennials, who were more likely to be guided through structured digital systems from adolescence, you had a foot in both. You were independent but not disconnected. You were idealistic but pragmatic. And that combination shapes how you approach identity. Think about social media. When it exploded, you were old enough to have a fully formed offline identity. You knew who you were before you curated it. That matters. Studies on identity formation show that when adolescence unfolds publicly under constant online observation, self-concept can become more externally anchored. But Xennials largely built their core selves in private spaces, bedrooms with posters, not profiles with filters. So even if you're active online now, there's often a quiet boundary inside you, a sense that your real life exists beyond the feed. And yet, you're not anti-technology. You adapted quickly. That adaptability is one of your psychological superpowers. Neuroscience tells us that the brain remains plastic, capable of rewiring well into adulthood. But change is easier if it's gradual. Xennials experienced technological change in waves, not a tidal flood at birth. You had time to integrate each shift. Cassette tapes to CDs, CDs to MP3s, MP3s to streaming, landlines to flip phones to smartphones. Each step required learning and relearning and letting go. That repeated cycle builds what psychologists call adaptive confidence, the belief that you can handle change because you've handled it before. But it also builds a certain fatigue. Sometimes you might feel like you're constantly updating. New apps, new norms, new slang, new expectations at work. You're not resisting progress, you're just tired of perpetual beta versions of life. And there's another layer. Xennials are often described as occupying a strange social role. You're young enough to understand younger colleagues, old enough to remember the mindset of older ones. You become translators. In meetings, you might find yourself explaining why flexibility and purpose matter, while also understanding the value of structure and loyalty. That in-between positioning can feel invisible at times. You're not the loudest generational narrative. There's endless think pieces about boomers and Gen Z, but Xennials, you're the bridge. And bridges are rarely the headline, but psychologically, bridges are powerful. They hold tension. They connect extremes. They allow movement. There's also nostalgia. Let's talk about that. When you hear a theme song from a 90s show, it hits differently. Not just because it's catchy, but because it represents a slower cognitive era, a time when attention wasn't monetized. Nostalgia isn't just sentimentality. Research suggests it can increase feelings of social connection and meaning. For Xennials, nostalgia often acts like emotional grounding. It reminds you of who you were before everything sped up. But here's the key. You don't want to go back. You just want balance. That's the psychological tension of your cohort. You're not anti-modern, you're anti-chaos. You appreciate innovation, but you crave intentionality. And that shows up in how many Xennials approach parenting, work, even friendships. There's often a conscious effort to slow things down, to log off sometimes, to create analog pockets in a digital life. You might insist on family dinners without phones, or feel oddly proud teaching your kid how to ride a bike without documenting every second on Instagram. It's not about rejecting the present, it's about preserving depth. Because you remember depth. And maybe, deep down, that's what defines the Xennial psychology most clearly. You know two speeds of the world, the slow burn and the instant ping. You know what it's like to wait and what it's like to refresh. You were shaped by both scarcity and abundance, of information, of connection, of opportunity. That duality can sometimes create identity confusion. Am I supposed to hustle constantly or prioritize balance? Should I embrace every new tool or protect my mental space? But that can also create wisdom, because you've seen enough change to know that no era is permanent. Trends fade, platforms rise and fall, cultural norms shift. And through it all, you're still here, adapting. If any of this feels uncomfortably accurate, I'd love to know. Do you feel more analog at heart, more digital, or constantly toggling between both? Drop your thoughts in the comments, not to label yourself, but to reflect. Because understanding the era that shaped you is one of the most powerful forms of self-awareness. And if you're curious about the hidden psychology behind other microgenerations, cultural shifts, or the invisible forces that shape how you think and feel, stick around. There's always more happening beneath the surface of your identity than you realize, especially if you grew up on both sides of the dial tone.